This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Cool. Well, lovely to meet you all.
Thank you. Right, over to you now.
Okay. Well, so this paper that I'm giving right now is a kind of general introduction to my research on the Ford Foundation's activities in China from the early 1980s to the present day. So I pay particular attention to the Ford Foundation's reproductive and sexual health programs. So I'll just sketch this history of Ford Foundation's engagement with China in a very schematic way. So soon after the initiation of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 1970s, the Chinese government actively invited American government agents and university academics and NGO directors, particularly those who were working for or associated with the Ford Foundation, to assist in the development and redevelopment and dramatic expansion of social sciences in China. And social sciences were important because for Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese government, it would be the sort of apparatus generating reliable knowledge and policy recommendations for Chinese experiments in market economy and social and legal reform. And by the late 1980s, the Ford Foundation established a field office in Beijing with the aim of directly sponsoring projects designed by Chinese academics in higher education and research institutions. And prior to this move, the Ford actually concentrated exclusively on funding European American scholars in China studies, so part of the story of the politics of so-called area studies in the 60s and 70s. Now, some of the major beneficiaries of this influx of Ford Foundation grants in China in the late 1980s for projects on economic policies and quantitative economics and civil and criminal jurisdiction reform and rural poverty and development included the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, also in Beijing, Fudan University in Shanghai, and the Renmin University of China in Beijing. And by the early 1990s, the Ford Foundation extended its support to interventions in family planning services and reproductive health in China, following the program of action devised at the United Nations 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, which was in Cairo in Egypt. The Ford Foundation rebranded its population stream to include investigations in sexual behaviors and sexual cultures, especially in the developing world. Globally, Ford Foundation officers promoted a holistic vision of sexual well-being or sexual happiness that not only involved the absence of reproductive problems or sexually transmitted diseases, but also every individual's entitlement, this is a key word, entitlement to pleasure and fulfillment in intimate life. Such concerns in the 1980s and 1990s, 90s in particular, dovetailed the Chinese state's interest in a choreographed sexual revolution, the maintenance of social stability by the strengthening of familial harmony, and the cultivation of appropriate kinds of heterosexual desires. And throughout the process, officers from the Ford Foundation keenly understood that China's opening up to the world would necessarily bring about a kind of concomitant transformation of gender norms and sexual values, and they wanted to claim a stake in guiding and stewarding the Chinese sexual revolution. And this piece of research on orgasmic pedagogy, as I call it, my research on the Ford Foundation is enabled by recently released archival materials deposited at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, New York. And these archival materials are an extremely rich source, providing insights on the motivations of and the constant negotiations between the Ford Foundation's board of trustees, directors, committee members, and officers working around the world. And I'll just quickly mention here that unlike other major philanthropic foundations, the Ford Foundation archives had a remarkably short embargo period, which is 10 years. The Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, by contrast, operate on an embargo period for its archival materials of around 30 years. This means that the Ford Foundation's activities around the world, including activities in China, could be studied in this year up to the year 2004, which offers a privileged standpoint from which to investigate the very recent operations of a foreign, powerful, extremely wealthy NGO in China. And my ongoing investigation has also involved conducting oral histories with people, and what I hope to accomplish is to dissect some of the tensions as well as convergences between ambitions of transnational NGOs and the agenda of Chinese actors. At the same time, I think, anyway, this is the aim, the ambition, my materials open up a sort of micro-history of groups of Ford Foundation officers, as well as a more large-scale account on the insertions and circulations of what Foucault would call biopower and governmentality around the world. So let me just quickly contextualize my research on the Ford Foundation along two lines. First, with respect to my book project on the imaginations and transformation of sexuality in 20th century China, and second, with respect to some of our current scholarship on gender and sexuality in the post-socialist era. And here, I want to sort of flag and recommend this wonderful book by anthropologist and China studies scholar Leon Rocha, Desiring China, Experiments in Neoliberalism, Sexuality and Public Culture. So, my book project, which is called Harnessing Pleasure, Imagining Chinese Sexuality in the 20th Century, analyzes the multiple ways that Chinese sexuality has been conceptualized and represented in intellectual and medical scientific discourses in the 20th century within and outside of China. In particular, the point of doing this is that I pay attention to claims that have been made about sexual pleasure with Chinese characteristics, which have carried serious consequences like the reconstruction or reinvention of cultural traditions, the enforcement of certain gender norms and regimes of socialization, or the facilitation of or embargo on the distribution of medical scientific knowledge. And my forthcoming book is divided into 4 sections, and the material on the Ford Foundation belongs to the 4th and final section on the question of pleasure, normality, and neoliberal subjectivities in contemporary China. So, post-socialist China sexuality. So let me just read out a quotation from Leon Rocha's Desiring China. She summarizes her argument in the following way. So this is Rocha. A sea change has swept through China in the last 15 years to replace socialist experimentation with the universal human nature imagined as the essential ingredient of cosmopolitan worldliness. The model of human nature has the desiring subject as its core, the individual who operates through sexual, material, and affective self-interest. Desire is a key cultural practice in which both the government and the citizens reconfigure the relationship to a post-socialist world. In official, intellectual, and popular discourses, this desiring subject is portrayed as a new human being who will help to usher a new era in China. And Leon Rocha calls the new China that this figures, it's called Desiring China. So Leon Rocha was elaborating on theorization of neoliberalism by people like Nicholas Rose or Wendy Brown or David Harvey and so forth, and who were in turn engaging or thinking about Foucault's later work on the birth of biopolitics and governmentality and so on and so forth. So this project of making a new universal human nature involves kind of interpolating new citizens as subjects of entrepreneurial choices. So human beings become individuals who are empowered to act as experts of themselves and their own bodies. They become interfaced with ethical regimes and regulatory techniques through which they govern their affective and intimate lives, and sexuality and sexual desire belong to that most explosive and powerful realm for constructing novel citizen subjects, not merely in China, but in China's reconfiguration of its relationship to a post-socialist world. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. And I agree fundamentally, by the way, with Leon Rocha's diagnosis on sexuality and neoliberalism. She talks about sexuality and neoliberalism by looking at popular culture. But what I'm more interested in is the dissemination of expert knowledges in China, from medical advice on reproductive health and sexual pleasure to social and psychological theories on sexual well-being and sexual happiness, and human potential and that sort of thing. Because these are knowledges which claim authority and objectivity and disinterestedness, and they have notions of sort of scientific truth conferred upon them. And they're part of a whole series of apparatuses that legislate what constitutes normal pleasures and abnormal desires, and they inform the work of gender activists and sex sociologists and policymakers and so on and so forth. And I argue that they are co-produced by numerous prestigious institutes within China, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences to university and medical clinics in Beijing and Shanghai, as well as major research centers in Europe and America, the Kinsey Institute, Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco, Johns Hopkins, McGill, Humboldt University in Berlin, and so forth. So, the the Ford Foundation itself. I'll very quickly introduce the Ford Foundation in case you guys haven't really come across it or have not looked into it in detail. So it's headquartered in Manhattan. It is currently the 5th wealthiest charitable foundation in the world, behind the Stitching Inca Foundation, which is funded by IKEA. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is number 2. Number 3 is Wellcome Trust, which is sort of next door. And number 4 is Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And it was originally founded by Henry Ford, of course, and his son Edsel Ford in 1936, with an endowment of 2.3 billion US dollars, and it now has an endowment of approximately 11 billion US dollars. The Ford Foundation, by the 1970s, had nothing to do with the Ford Motor Company anymore. It's a sort of autonomous NGO. The Ford Foundation's current mission is this, so quote, "We believe all people should have the opportunity to reach their full potential, contribute to society, and have voice in the decisions that affect them." And the Ford Foundation's mission statement has evolved over time, from its first formulation in the advancement of human welfare in 1949 to the incorporation of ideas on human capabilities and human potential, which is in turn influenced by development discourses and the work of Amartya Sen, basically. So as it presently stands, the Ford Foundation operates with 8 funding streams. So democratic and accountable government, economic fairness, education opportunity and scholarship, freedom of expression, gender, sexuality and reproductive justice, human rights, metropolitan opportunity, and sustainable development. All of these programs have evolved over time, which I'm not going to talk about, but I'm going to talk about the reproductive health bit, which has its origins in the population program, which in turn was part of the economic development administrative stream from the 1950s. So a portion of the population program's history and the Ford Foundation's intense interest in the 50s and 60s in demography and statistics in the development world have been discussed by numerous other scholars. But suffice it to say here that in 1963, the United Nations General Assembly and the National Academy of Sciences in the United States officially called attention to the need for population programs, and in response, the Ford Foundation pledged around 21 million US dollars to support projects in South Asian and North African nations, often in collaboration with Population Council, which is based in Washington, D.C. In the following 25 years or so, the Ford Foundation diversified its initiatives and supported work on delivery of reproductive and family planning services around the world, family planning for rural disadvantaged women, prevention of pregnancy-related disability and death, promotion of postnatal care and infants' healthy development, control of sexually transmitted diseases and HIV/AIDS from the 1980s onwards. By 1990, in recognition of the importance of individuals' reproductive health, and in recognition of the Foundation's move away from supporting macro studies on population and demographic patterns, the Ford Foundation rebranded the population stream as the Reproductive Health and Population Stream. And by 1997 or so, the Reproductive Health and Population Stream was subsumed under Human Development and Reproductive Health. So sort of fast forward a little bit. There were 2 basically key events for the history of Ford Foundation's engagement with reproduction and sexuality. One was the aforementioned International Conference on Population Development, which is in Cairo in September 1994, and the other was the 4th World Conference on Women, held in Beijing in 1995. So I'll just quickly talk about the International Conference on Population Development in Cairo in September 1994, which was actually a very controversial conference, as some of you might know, because the particular controversial part was that the conference involved lengthy debates on the concept of reproductive rights, and received this huge media coverage because one of the key points in debate on reproductive rights was whether there was a right to abortion. And basically delegates representing 2 opposite sides of the argument, they lobbied government representatives and transnational bodies, and there was no consensus was reached, right? However, in any case, the ICPD program, the ICPD conference came up with a program of action, which is all about the holistic approach to the question of health, whereby reproductive and sexual health is not simply the absence of diseases, but a state of complete well-being and happiness. And this state of complete well-being and happiness would involve the fulfillment of a minimal set of entitlements and conditions, and so on and so forth. And so the Ford Foundation's discourse of sexuality post-ICPD in 1994 regularly invokes the language of universality, rights, fulfillment, entitlement, mutual exchange, pleasures, accountability, performance, fairness, tolerance, empowerment, self-knowledge, respect, harmony, and sexual happiness. I mean, you can think about what that constellation of words imply. This constellation of words, this discourse, makes absolutely explicit a normative ideal of sexuality. And the Ford Foundation broadened its support in the mid-1990s from relatively value-neutral projects centered on the delivery of reproductive technologies to those that actively involve the investigation and shaping of gender norms and sexual values. And I have a section here which I'm going to skip a little bit on the chief architect behind this kind of construction of a kind of ideal normative version of sexuality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the reason that Ford Foundation went into started funding projects on gender and sexuality in the 90s, and that particularly important event was actually the Tiananmen Square student protest in 1989. The Tiananmen Square student protest in 1989 was a particularly important flashpoint because basically during that time the NGOs were hit extremely hard by the Chinese government. Institutes and organizations were dissolved by the government, or projects were shut down temporarily or indefinitely. Academics went on leave or were on sort of indefinite sabbatical or suspended. Numerous researchers were arrested on charges of conspiring to subvert the government. Plans for publication and disseminations of research outcomes were delayed and shelved, and so on and so forth. Now, in the long term, Tiananmen Square did not completely shut down NGOs and their activities in China, but the Ford Foundation decided that they had to diversify its portfolio, funding portfolio, beyond funding legal reform and human rights, particularly human rights. It's a tricky one. They want to find a way of continue talking about human rights without actually talking about human rights. And the most promising avenue to pursue, it turned out, was reproductive health and sexuality, right? Because the idea that reproduction and sexuality were a fundamental component of universal human nature, and that instilling a sense of sexual well-being and sexual happiness, care of the self, individual's entitlement and pleasure, intimate life and fulfillment, fulfilling one's self-potential, yada, 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 could apparently assist in building a culture of human rights and human dignity from the ground up. So doing sexuality is doing human rights by other means. Transforming individual sexuality will lead to bottom-up, peaceful evolution of citizenship and civil society, supplementing the top-down legal programs on protection of human rights and so on. So that's the kind of sort of ideological agenda behind that. So I'm going to move on to orgasmic pedagogy. Having set all of that up in about 20 minutes, I now have about 20 minutes to talk about this specific case. So I'm going to discuss one particular grant. So there have been many grants in large and small within the Ford Foundation archives. I'm going to pick one particular grant. It was awarded to the Renmin University of China. It was a total of $88,000 US. $88,000 US from 1995 to 2000 over a 5-year period. I chose this grant not because it was a major program. In fact, I deliberately chose something that seemed modest or unremarkable and so on and so forth. The grant folder, by the way, still carries 2,000 pages of materials. And I chose this grant because it was probably, it demonstrates, I think, for me, how the Ford Foundation's agenda to inculcate a sense of sexual well-being and sexual happiness among ordinary Chinese men and women translated into a sort of local grassroots level. So the project was launched in 1999 by Professor Pan Suiming and his colleagues, at the Renmin University of China Institute for Research in Sexuality and Gender. It was supervised by Ford Foundation's Beijing office, and it was endorsed by the National Population and Family Planning Commission in China. And the project was intended to be a pilot for the dissemination of sexual knowledge among family planning cadres from Jinghai County in Tianjin, specifically those working in Dongshuangtang village, population 2,000, and Daqiuzhuangtang, which has a population roughly 6,000. These two sites were about 40 kilometers from the center of Tianjin, which is one of the major cities in northeast China. Both the Dongshuangtang village and the Daqiuzhuangtang were relatively poor until unprecedented levels of industrial investment in the 1980s and 1990s transformed them into prosperous communities, and in 2014 there are BMWs and Audis and whatnot. The team of experts sponsored by Ford included 6 professors and 4 members from the Jinghai County Family Planning Workers Association. The pilot project yielded a standard booklet exactly 100 pages in length entitled Sex Education Manual for Family Planning Workers. The manual incorporated feedback from the Jinghai workers. 31 trainees, 24 female and 7 male trainees were recruited for this pilot program, and the majority were around 40 years of age. All of them were married. The training involved a 1-week intensive course with lectures, videos, presentations, questionnaires, and discussions and role-playing to hone interpersonal skills. Each trainee received a certificate issued by the Renmin University of China at the end of the course. Moreover, the expert team from Renmin University of China returned to the villages for follow-up sessions and conducted ethnography on the family planning cadres themselves. And what I find so interesting is that discussions in the training program and the subsequent ethnographies center on giving and receiving pleasure, or giving and receiving orgasms, on husband-wife intimacy, on the eroticization of marriage, on the absolute paramount importance of female orgasms, the wife's orgasms, to sexual well-being and familial and communal harmony. And to put this in a slightly impertinent manner, the idea is very much that if everyone comes, everything's got to be all right. So I'm just going to read out an ethnography conducted by the team on a family planning ganbu, who said, I was willing to know something about sexuality for a very long time, but there really was no chance to learn. Even for myself, when I was making love, I had a sense of desiring sexual satisfaction and orgasm, but never experienced pleasant sensations during intercourse. After the training conducted by the Renmin University, not only did I obtain useful sexual knowledge, I also mastered some skills which made the relationship with my husband more harmonious, and which would help people who come to me make their relationships with their husbands and wives more harmonious. Moreover, I began to know how to help those who never felt pleasure from their sexual activities, and so forth. There's a whole range of ethnographies, interviews that were done on these family planning ganbu, family planning cadres, and they more or less said the same thing. The trainees in the 2 Jinghai villages, they talked about the way that it incorporated the newly acquired knowledge in sexual pleasure and sexual techniques. One woman wanted to divorce her husband because she was unhappy or even frightened with her husband's request to make love. This became increasingly problematic after her menopause. The cadre managed to convince the woman who came to see her that the desire to make love is a natural and physiological reaction for men, and is not at all vulgar behavior. And the woman said she would apologize to her husband and try to take pleasure in sexual life. In another case, a woman thought her vaginal flatulence, in vulgar terms, queefing, after sexual intercourse was an illness, and spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars seeking a cure, presumably from quack doctors. She was reassured by the family planning cadres that the expulsion of air after sex was perfectly normal. In yet another case, a couple attended family planning centers together, and they received advice on foreplay and various sexual positions that helped them overcome their difficulties, and they ended up being a quote-unquote happy unit. And the Sex Education Manual for Family Planning Workers, which the 100-page training manual for family planning cadres was produced out of this Ford Foundation funded program, makes this framing of sexual pleasure with the languages of rights and entitlement abundantly clear. The 100-page booklet is divided into 4 sections, 2 major sections on male sexuality and female sexuality, and then 2 smaller sections on sexually transmitted diseases and sex education for children and adolescents. The 2 sections on male and female sexuality are both in turn divided into 3 subsections: sexual harmony, common misconceptions and myths, and sexual dysfunction, sexual play, and paraphernalia. Each of those subsections follow a Q&A format. So the idea is very much that these are likely to be the questions that would be asked by people who came to visit family planning cadres, and these would be the standard answers that we would. Some of these questions are very interesting. So for instance, is it morally reprehensible to engage in multiple sexual positions while having intercourse with your husband or wife? And the standard answer to that question is no. Is it morally reprehensible to leave the lights on while one has sex with husband or wife? And the standard answer is no, right? So that kind of Q&A. And I find particularly interesting the subsections or the Q&A, the various questions on sexual psychological secrets of men and women, which basically spelled out a contract that husbands and wives needed to become aware of. Husbands should understand a few fundamental essential components of female sexual psychology, and in turn women need to grasp the essential components of male sexual psychology. The other sections, the other questions cover aspects on the art of love, oral stimulation, mutual simultaneous oral sex, mutual masturbation, digital insertion, erotic massages, foreplay techniques, sexual positions, exercise for training vaginal muscles, the importance for women to vocalize during intercourse. It is not morally reprehensible for women to vocalize during intercourse. The necessity of maintaining genital cleanliness, keeping up an attractive appearance, and cultivating a loving personality. Men and women are reassured that oral sex or changing sexual positions or vocalization, orgasm, etc., or leaving the lights on, whatever, having sex during the day, in the afternoon, in the morning, all of these are not perverted. There are, however, limits and taboo. For instance, anal sex, no. Same-sex encounters, no. Group sex, no. Extramarital sex, no. Use of pornography, discouraged. Particularly interesting is the question of oral sex to completion. So oral sex as part of the foreplay script, good. Oral sex to completion, no. Right? 69, good. 69 to completion, no. All of these techniques and facts of life are presented with a very clear narrative. There's an invitation to acquire self-knowledge and to become empowered experts of their own bodies, for ordinary Chinese people to become experts of their own bodies via experimentation, by following the sexual script that's laid out in the manual. There is what I may call an orgasmic imperative. A husband, and especially a wife, having orgasms is a right, an entitlement, a duty, and a responsibility. This is accompanied by repeated emphasis on fairness, symmetry, and the mutual exchange of pleasure. A social contract with sexual climaxes on a roughly 50-50 basis. Finally, there is the injunction, the compulsion to enjoy. To have regular sexual pleasure is to attain sexual well-being and sexual happiness. Sexual well-being, in turn, is the bedrock of a balanced individual, bedrock of a joyous marriage, healthy family, harmonious society, happy nation, and so forth. As the manual makes absolutely explicit, even on its first page, Chinese couples have to reconceptualize sexual intercourse as making love, right, in English. And making love is a fundamental part of universal human nature and human civilization. The manual argues that the insertion of medical scientific knowledge into intimate life should not be seen as threatening or invasive. An individual self-interest in acquiring pleasure is not antagonistic to, but runs in exactly the same direction as the interest of the collective. The pleasure principle converges with the governmental. So to spell things out a little bit more, by way of concluding, this was a pilot program that was conducted by a team of experts, mostly from Beijing's Renmin University of China, training family planning cadres in a village and town on heterosexual techniques and the centrality of heterosexual pleasures and orgasms, right? It's like, training cadres to provide basically orgasmic lessons for people, ordinary Chinese men and women who would come to these family planning clinics for advice on reproduction sexuality. The program produces a manual that could be circulated among family planning cadres across the country, and it did circulate. That's a separate paper. And the manual incorporates a sexual ideology that exalts the right to mutual equal exchanges of orgasms, which is an ideology that, as we know, animates Western sexology and sexual psychology, particularly post-Masters and Johnson. And that informs the Ford Foundation's construction of the reproductive health and sexuality stream post-International Conference on Population Development in 1994. And this sexual ideology harnesses that biological drive to seek sexual pleasure towards productive end, which is maintenance of self, maintenance of social fabric, and so forth. And the project is funded by a modest grant from the Ford Foundation, and the rationale for support, as detailed by the program officer, is that Pan Suiming and associates at the Renmin University of China, their agenda converges with the Ford Foundation's reproductive health framework, which, according to the Ford Foundation, squarely recognizes the need to understand the central role that sexual issues and sexual life play in the attainment of genuine health for individuals, families, and communities, and the fulfillment of genuine human potential. The program received high praise from local officials in the Jinghai County, from the Family Planning Bureau in central Tianjin, and from the Family Planning National Population and Family Planning Commission, which is a Chinese state agency. The afterlife of the training program and the wider circulation of the sexual education manual, as I said, would be a separate paper. But this case study illustrates how the agenda of a global philanthropic body like the Ford Foundation links up with attempts in China to instill a new kind of citizens, or to I guess, interpolate a new kind of citizenship, practicing appropriate kinds of desire, interface with sexological knowledge, governing and monitoring and regulating their own affective and intimate lives. So we come back to what I've described at the beginning, following Lisa Rocha's work. This is about the creation of desire in China and the inauguration of neoliberal subjectivities in China in 1980s and 1990s. So I guess finally I would just make some very quick remarks on the question of the Chinese sexual revolution. So first of all, the family planning worker pilot project was directed by the sociologist, Chinese sociologist and sexologist Pan Suiming, who's a very well-known public intellectual in China, and whose work on gender and sexuality and prostitution, actually in particular, is highly influential. His Institute for Research in Sexuality and Gender at the Renmin University of Beijing has continued to receive generous support from the Ford Foundation, including all the work on sexual happiness and sexual prosperity and so forth. So in the book itself, I analyzed the way that Pan Suiming, as well as other intellectuals, mobilized a particular historiography of Chinese and Western sexuality to justify the projects. So Pan Suiming's interventions, including a local project to train family planning cadres in sexual knowledge so that the family planning cadres can teach ordinary Chinese men and women about orgasms, that sort of projects was animated by understanding there has to be an ongoing sexual revolution in post-Maoist China, which liberates the Chinese from the sexual repression that they allegedly suffered during the Cultural Revolution. The Chinese sexual revolution, according to Pan and other intellectuals in that sort of constellation, consists of multiple stages. Stage one followed the introduction of family planning policy in 1979, when the Chinese allegedly emerged from the state of darkness, ignorance, and sexual blindness that they suffered in the Maoist period. The Chinese recognized that at that time that sex was not just for procreation. And stage two allegedly began in the 1980s, when the Chinese people began to acknowledge that sex was a universal fundamental human right. Stage three allegedly took place in the 1990s, when the Chinese realized that sex was not just limited to married couples. And the current stage four, Pan Suiming argues, involves the gradual rejection of marriage as the norm and the depathologization and flourishing of alternative sexualities in urban China. And there is like a stage five in a more distant future that might involve legal reform to protect people with these alternative sexualities and identities. And Pan Suiming and his colleagues believe that, armed with objective medical and scientific knowledge, as well as historical lessons learned from the sexual revolution in Europe and America, which according to this narrative was an uncontrollable explosion of identity desires as opposed to a more maintained, more choreographed sexual revolution. Scientific experts in China could be active players steering the Chinese sexual revolution in an enlightened, rational, and safe and stable manner. They could help direct the built-in energies and vitalities and instincts of the Chinese people towards good and healthy and productive ends, whatever that means. The universal human nature, i.e. sexuality, of all Chinese people is to be unleashed and emancipated, but unleashed and emancipated in a particular way. This perspective, by the way, is shared by the officials endorsing the Jinghai County project, the Orgasmic Pedagogy project. So, for instance, Wu Shiji, who is the director of the Family Planning Association in the local area, pointed to the ignorance and the old-fashioned beliefs and customs among many Chinese villagers, and praised the team of experts funded by the Ford Foundation for bringing a much-needed revolution in sexual behaviors and mentalities to this particular locality. The secretary of the Family Planning Association at the national level also spoke for a need for a bottom-up revolution. And the project evaluation reports, which are submitted to the Ford Foundation by experts at the National China Population Information Research Center and the National Population and Family Planning Commission, discuss the scientific transmission of sexual facts and the importance of setting individuals on the right track by imparting them with correct information with regard to sexual pleasure in the face of the rapid transformations and the media explosion across the nation. For these representatives of the state, the Chinese sexual revolution has to be and can indeed be carefully managed. This is, of course, very far away from I was just thinking about the so-called Marcusean perspective. So Marcusean perspective is something like libidinal revolution could bring about the dismantling of power, but in this case, it's sexual revolution in a choreographed way that could insert power in the state more deeply than ever before into people's subjectivities. So the sexual revolution in contemporary China is often said to be caused by these factors: growing wealth in the industrial revolution, migration of millions from villages to cities, investments from foreign corporations, information explosion to the ordinary people, and so on and so forth. And Chinese studies scholars have followed the sexual revolution via literary and filmic representations, ethnographies, and interviews among diverse social groups residing in urban as well as rural areas, or shifts in demographic patterns or government policies or whatever. But what I want to do here via this paper and in the book as well is offer a glimpse of a transnational state NGO academic complex that seeks to supervise that Chinese sexual revolution using medical and scientific knowledge. And that's it.